if you're not a Christian, there's a reason you're not a Christian. And I think you have whatever your reason is, it's a good reason. In other words, if we were talking, sitting across the table from each other, and you would say, Andy, here's my deal. Look, I know God is good and God is great, and I know, all that stuff. But look at all the stuff going on in the world. It's just too big. There's just too much suffering. Maybe that's kind of your obstacle, because if you have a reason, it's like an obstacle between you and Christianity. And I would say, I wouldn't go, oh, that's stupid. I would go, that's huge. Well, let's talk about that. Or maybe your obstacle is you've known too many Christians, and you're thinking, why would I want to be one of those? I'm a better person than all the Christians I've met. That's realistic. That's an obstacle, and that's valid. I don't blame you. Maybe your deal is you were just raised in a completely different type of religion or a different kind of tradition or religious tradition. And you go, the problem with you Christians is you think you're the only ones that are right and everybody else is wrong. And I just have a problem with that. And you know what? That's a valid question. That's a valid issue. That's a real obstacle to you ever becoming a Christian. And it would be crazy not to admit that. Or maybe it's along the same lines. It's, well, what about all the other religions in the world? Maybe your deal is you heard Christians or heard Christian radio or Christian television, and you get the idea that we think that Jesus is the only way, and you think maybe Jesus is a good way, but you don't think Jesus is the only way, and you can't get past this exclusive claim of Jesus. That's a valid obstacle. I mean, we'd be crazy, or I'd be crazy to say, well, just ignore that and become a Christian anyway. You can't do that. You can't be intellectually honest and do that. Or maybe your deal is you're starting to kind of believe the whole thing, but your family didn't, your parents didn't, your grandfather didn't, and maybe it's a real emotional obstacle for you because you think, if I ever embrace the teachings of Jesus, that's admitting that my mom and my dad and my grandfather, who I had so much respect for, that's like saying they're wrong. And you just can't bring yourself to say that. I understand that. That's a real obstacle. You'd be crazy just to ignore that and just, to do something some silly preacher told you to do. I get that. Maybe your obstacle isn't even that specific. In fact, I think there are a lot of people who fall in this category. The reason you're not a Christian is because you just don't care. It's just not a big deal. In other words, if I said, why won't you become a Christian? You'd say, well, why don't you become an astronaut? Why don't you become a fireman? Why don't you stand on one foot all day long? I don't know. I don't care. It's not even, I don't feel any tension. I don't feel any draw. I don't feel any need. I mean, Andy, that's great for you and all those other naive people. That's fine. But I just don't care. That's why I'm not a Christian. It's just not, I guess if I fell in love with somebody who's a Christian and I become a Christian, I don't know. It's just not a big deal to me. Those would be some of your obstacles. Adults who become Christians generally don't do so by working through their obstacles. Generally, they become Christians because something happens that shrinks their obstacles, that shrinks their questions. They have the same questions and the same obstacles, and they embrace Christianity anyway, and they just carry them along right into their newfound Christian faith. Because becoming a Christian as an adult rarely entails, working intellectually through all the obstacles. Instead, something happens that shrinks them. One of the things we hear a lot about here is, somebody has some big tragedy, and it's not always this way, but some huge tragedy. And suddenly here's a man or a woman who's had all kinds of obstacles and all kinds of issues with Christians and faith and the Bible and miracles. You got to be kidding and walking on water. I don't think so. You've had all these great questions, and then suddenly tragedy strikes, and the same man or woman finds himself on their knees beside their bed, arguing and negotiating with the God they weren't even sure they believed in, and suddenly they believe. Because suddenly in a moment, instead of intellectual, instead of categorical, it becomes real personal. And suddenly, whether or not Adam and Eve were historical figures does not matter. And how did they get the dinosaurs on the ark doesn't matter. And, who wrote the Bible doesn't matter. And can an axe head float doesn't matter. And were they 7 literal days of creation doesn't matter. And what about science? And what about my English teacher? And what about my biology professor? All that stuff that were huge obstacles to faith. In the midst of tragedy, suddenly, all those things, they don't go away. They just get real small. And all of a sudden, the idea of God gets real personal because, God, I need you. I don't even know if you're out there. I need you. And people come to have extraordinary faith when suddenly a loved one is sick. When suddenly they realize, I'm addicted. And if I'm going to become unaddicted, I need help outside myself. It's amazing how tragedy shrinks all the obstacles, and they don't go away and they don't get resolved. They just get real small. And suddenly the God thing is no longer a category. It's personal. Sometimes it's not that way. Sometimes somebody just starts reading their Bible. They're like, okay, I give up. I'll read my Bible. You know, your husband or your wife saying, look, or your parents are paying you, or you have a boss that says, okay, look, just read your Bible. You think, I'll get in good with the boss. I'll read. You know, I don't know how it happens. People just start reading their Bible, and they have all these objections. They don't even think the Bible's true. That, you know, they believe, all kinds of stuff about the Bible. They start reading it, and in the process of reading the Bible, they're surprised by this sense of, I believe this. I believe this. And again, their obstacles aren't gone. Their questions aren't even answered. They just get smaller. So I want to talk to the guys for just a second, then I'll talk to ladies. Men, all the married men who are married, do you remember all the reasons you had for not getting married when you were single? Just think for a second. When somebody would come to you and you weren't interested in getting married, and they'd say, hey, why don't you get married? And you immediately said, because of the wonderful things, you had all these lists, right? In fact, if you're a single guy, and you're not interested in married, you're really happily single, and you look at your married friends going, I'll take my single problems over their married problems. And somebody says, hey, you ought to marry her. Why don't you get married? And you immediately have a bunch of reasons. I wrote down a few reasons. Here's some of the reasons that why we didn't want to get married. Right, guys? Ladies, don't chastise us. God made us this way, I think. I don't know. This is why I work. Remember, you don't want to give up your freedom because you're free. That's great. You don't want to be committed, right? You don't want to be committed. If you still don't want to be committed, you don't have enough money to get married. Remember that? You would say, I can't afford to be married. I can't even buy everything I want. How can I buy everything I and she wants? And then there's the money thing. And then, this number 4, other married people I know. Because you look at the other married people you know and go, why would I want to do that? I mean, I'd rather be lonely than stuck. I'd rather be single than miserable. Maybe you looked at your own parents and you went, and I'm just talking to men. Women process this a little bit differently. Too young. And then what if I meet somebody else? I mean, what if I commit and give her the ring, and then it's like, I wish I'd given her the, what if a week later or 2 weeks later or right after I say I do, what if we're at the reception? Right? What if the caterer shows up and I'm like, oh, darn, I should have waited to meet the caterer. What? In other words, there's that whole thing of what. Now, here's the thing, guys. Think with me, okay? We're just introducing an idea. How many of these did you work through thoroughly before you got married? None. In other words, now you may be the exception, okay? I've not met every married man in the world, but just in my, brief time on this planet, I've never met a guy that said, well, here's what I did before I got married. I made my list, and I started working through it. I worked through the freedom thing. I just got there, and I got a couple of books, and then I put check, willing to give up my freedom. Then I thought, why am I so afraid to be committed? And I looked at other areas of my life where I was willing to commit, and I realized my issue is I'm not afraid of commitment. Commitment really isn't the issue. I'm just afraid to commit to uncertainty, but there is an element of uncertainty in all things, and so commitment really isn't the problem. Check. And then, Andy, I saved and saved and saved and saved and saved and saved and saved enough money, and when I was about 55 years old, I realized, I think I got enough money to get married if I marry somebody with really low expectations. So I went way outside the big city of Atlanta to one of the smallest towns I could find, and I met this girl who had very low expectations. No, and then I put a check by that. And then I just surrounded myself with happily married people. I waited till I was older, and then I decided once I meet her, I'll just have my eyes put out, so that I'll never, ever, ever be attracted to or tempted. I won't ask you to raise your hands, guys. But I feel pretty confident, me included, that none of us resolved any of this before we got married. Why? It's very simple. Just kidding. Just kidding. No, it's not, isn't it at all? It's just a quick little thing, okay? What happened is you fell in love. You did. Because, see, before love came along, marriage was a category. And as long as it was a category, you could talk about, well, I don't want to give up this, I don't want to give up that, and I'm too young, and I have money, and I know miserable people, and what if. I mean, you could just object. And anybody that pressured you into trying to get married, even marry somebody you were dating, you had an obstacle. And they were real. I'm not discounting them. They were very, very real. And then you met a somebody. In other words, you weren't talking about marriage anymore. You were talking about marry. It wasn't about, commitment for the rest of my life. It was about her. It wasn't about women. It was about she. That one right over there by the counter. That one. And once it moved from the category of marriage to marrying that specific person, it became very personal. And you got married in spite of the fact that you didn't want to give up your freedom, in spite of the fact that you were afraid of commitment, in spite of the fact that you did not have enough money. You knew a lot of unhappily married people because you knew this was going to be different. You were way too young. In fact, your parents told you were too young. And you thought, even if I meet somebody else, I will never meet anybody else like her. You see, these didn't go away. They just got smaller in the face of the personal nature of falling in love. Now, here's all I want to say today. That's how adults become Christians. They don't become Christians because they work through a list, because I'm telling you, whatever your objection is to Christianity, I could give you a book about that. And you would read the book, and maybe you couldn't even out-argue the author, but that wouldn't make you a Christian. Any more than explaining to you that it's okay to give up freedom, commitment, blah, blah, blah. We could work through all of those things. You wouldn't be married. You just have a lot more information. Christianity is at its very nature so incredibly personal. Adults don't become Christians because they work through all their obstacles. Oftentimes, they just shrink the obstacles and carry them with us right in to a life of embracing and following Jesus Christ. Because something happens, something good, sometimes something bad, sometimes it's a surprise. Something happens that simply begins to shrink down all these obstacles.